You're listening to Talk in the Library, a National Library of Israel podcast.
Welcome to Talk in the Library. I'm your host, Wendy Singer. Silence may be golden in a library, but here in Jerusalem, we're breaking the rules to bring the vibrant spirit of Israeli and Jewish culture to life. Join us as we tackle big topics and the stories that shape us. I invited Mati Friedman to the studio this morning to bring insights from his writings into conversation with the moment that we're in. Mati, an award-winning journalist, has written prolifically about some of Israel's wars and how Israelis and Jews have confronted trauma and emerged resilient. He's the author of 4 nonfiction books: Who by Fire, Pumpkin Flowers, which was a New York Times notable book, Spies of No Country, and the Aleppo Codex, winner of the prestigious Sammy Rohr Prize. He has a forthcoming book, Out of the Sky, Heroism and Rebirth in Nazi Europe, that is due out in March of 2026. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Smithsonian, and he is a regular columnist at the Free Press. Hi, Mati. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with, how do you describe the moment that we're in?
I think that anyone who expects Israel to be in a kind of post-war euphoria is going to be very disappointed. And I think they've expected people here to be happier than they seem. In many ways, we haven't been given an opportunity to appreciate what we've been through. I think that we need to take a moment to think about the 2 years that just passed, and of course to mourn everything that's gone wrong, but also to appreciate that this is a society that walked through an incredible trauma that lasted for 2 years, which included not just the trauma of October 7th and hundreds of military fatalities, but also rocket barrages from Iran, which were very scary even by Israeli standards. And I think we can be proud of ourselves for staying intact through this whole thing. And if you walk around Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, the cities feel almost normal, and we take that for granted as Israelis, but I don't think we should. I think many other societies would not have withstood the body blows of the past 2 years, and it's a real credit to the people who live here, and I think we need to appreciate it. So Israel's in a weird moment in that regard, where the war is kind of over, but not really over, and we don't know if the ceasefire is going to last or not last. It actually feels quite brittle, and there are surges of violence on all of the fronts where there's supposedly a ceasefire. So it's a very kind of in-between kind of moment, and very ambiguous moment, I think.
I'm thinking about what we do to carry on and how we pick up the pieces and move on to create. There was this sit-in that was happening every Shabbat morning at the corner of Pierre Koenig and Ben Zakkai, and it was from all the synagogues in the area. And every Shabbat morning for about the last 6 or 8 months, there would be a gathering after the tefillah was over. I know that Hakel was your community was very involved there as well. And there would just be singing. There would be a Dvar Torah, some words of Torah about somehow connecting it to the hostages. And a lot of the people who were most involved in the struggle for the release of the hostages. Certainly Rachel and John Polin were there on a regular basis, and a lot of the other people in our communities were there. And I have in mind that on the Shabbat right before the release of the hostages, that Rav Benny Lau came and spoke. And in the crowd of about 1,000 people, there was Natan Sharansky, and we know what his story is. And there was the mother of Ben Zussman, Sarit Zussman. And basically, Rav Lau looked at the crowd. He talked about what a road ahead we have. And he said, but I see Natan Sharansky here, and I see Sarit Zussman here, and I know that if they could pick up the pieces, that we have as a society what it takes. What's your thought on that?
Right. Sarit's son Ben was killed in the war. I think we have an incredible dissonance between our leadership and the people in Israel. The examples you gave are really good ones because they illustrate the quality of the Israeli population, which is really unlike any other place I've ever seen. And I'm saying that as someone who's lived here for 30 years, and my rose-tinted glasses are off, but I've never been in another country that has the kind of people who live here in terms of their level of commitment and creativity. And we really saw it in the first months after October 7th, when the country was essentially saved by its populace, by people going to do reserve duty, by people picking crops because all of the farm workers had run away, by people housing Israelis who'd been displaced from the Gaza border and from the north, by people feeding the people who'd been displaced. And it was all volunteers. There was an incredible mobilization of the population. And there are people, I see Natan Sharansky, who's, of course, one of the great Jewish heroes of the 20th century. And, if you live around Jerusalem, you just see him doing his shopping. John and Rachel Poland is another example that you gave, the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who was kidnapped from the Nova Festival and then murdered in a tunnel under Gaza last summer. And these are the most amazing people you'll ever meet. So many of us are living with that gap between our leadership and the quality of our neighbors.
There's so much about the Hirsch Goldberg Poland story. There's just so much about how that defined the struggle for all the hostages and for the extraordinary engagement of John and Rachel in every global forum and every political audience that the mind could imagine. But I think one of the things that will be so much a part of our memory of this period is all the hostages that came out quoting Hirsch as that if you know your why, you'll figure out the how. And that, for me, is just one of the most incredible anecdotes, messages of this last period.
Yeah, and it's a good anecdote for a podcast that's coming out of the National Library, because, of course, it's a quote from a book by Viktor Frankl, which Hirsch knew well, and a quote written by someone who survived the Holocaust, and that was one of his lessons. And Hirsch clearly had that in his head and brought it to the other hostages who were just scrambling for some way to survive this hell that they'd been thrown into. I just read the new book by Eli Sharabi called Hostage, and it's really an admirable book. It's worth reading. And he mentions Hirsch, we met in captivity, and he mentions Hirsch bringing him that quote. So it's an example of why literary memory or, books can kind of have unintended consequences years after they're written. Absolutely. Or a lesson from one survivor could help someone else trying to survive something.
Actually, I know that the library tapped into exactly that kind of book wisdom and legacy in the very early days of the war. 2 Jerusalem psychologists from our neighborhood went to the head of culture at the library, Tzila Chayun, and they said, there are hundreds of social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists who are working, 24/7, and they're fried and they are just totally burned out, and we need to do something to give them some oxygen. And they put together this program called Ararat, which was doing exactly what you just said. It was tapping into some of the characters of figures in Jewish history and Israeli history that had faced crises and trauma and were resilient. And so this whole series of workshops was born, and it did exactly what you just said.
That's a great name, Ararat. And there's no question that in a time of crisis, people need that battery to kind of keep them going. And that battery here is the culture and history of the Jewish people. And you can see that the closer you are to that, the easier it is to withstand what we've had to withstand. So if you look at the religious Zionist community, which is closer to the books than many other Israelis, or even if you look at the Haredim, who have evaded this moment in Jewish history and have really failed the Jewish people, but they have a kind of resilience that's connected to their connection to the texts, and many other people lack that connection. And in a strange and very touching way, Hirsch brought them a fragment of that in a way that was very meaningful. You might think that during a war, who needs a library? Like, that seems very irrelevant to national defense, but in fact, there are a few things that are as relevant. There's a great quote from Tivia Lubetkin, who was one of the leaders of the ghetto uprising in Warsaw in 1943. And afterwards, she makes it to Israel. She makes it out of the ghetto. She comes to Israel and she testifies at the Eichmann trial. And she's explaining what they were trying to do in the Warsaw ghetto, testifying at the trial. So you can hear the recording. And she says that what the Germans were trying to do was to turn us into slaves and people without culture. And they were doing that by, among other things, closing the libraries. And we could not accept that. And we rebelled, not in a military sense. She said, of course, we weren't going to defeat the Wehrmacht. Our rebellion was a cultural rebellion. It was an example of how to respond when people try to take away your library. Basically, that's how she put it, which is really striking to hear someone describe an uprising against the Nazis using the word library. But that was what was important to her, and that was what was important for her to say to history at the Eichmann trial.
So it was like the battle cry of saving the library. That's really powerful. I'll give you one more anecdote before I turn to music. One of my strongest memories of this last 2 years is on October 7th. The new library building was about to open after some 14 years of being planned and designed and constructed. And when the missiles started coming down, the whole conservation team had to race to Jerusalem and take all of these precious ancient books and texts and manuscripts from the exhibit hall, from this Davidson exhibit hall, and rush them down to these underground vaults. So you had not just these old, iconic Jewish books like the Bamberg Talmud from the 16th century and the Damascus Crowns, but you also had a Quran from the 11th century and the Vulgate Bible. All of these together, these books from the three great religions, were being rushed to safety down below from Hamas missile fire. It's really head spinning. So Mati, let's talk for a minute about music. You rattled off all these different things that happen in the public space. I was struck by the role of musicians. There was this endless list of the most famous musicians in Israel: Barry Sakharov, Evyatar Banai, Ehud Banai, Rita. They were doing these concerts, but people kept going to these concerts by the thousands. So if you could say a word about that was going on the last 2 years, share with us the message of Who by Fire, your book about Leonard Cohen showing up here.
There's a tradition in Israel where war breaks out and your job as a musician is to entertain people who are affected by the war, primarily soldiers, but also people who've been displaced. And this has been going on since 1948. So, Shoshana Damari and other great dames of Israeli music, they would show up at the front, which of course in Israel, the front is an hour drive from Tel Aviv or 2 hours, but it's not like an American musician flying to Vietnam or flying to Iraq to entertain the troops. It's right here. So there's that tradition, and the musicians that you mentioned are following in that tradition where war breaks out. And if you're a musician, you probably don't have to fight, although there have been a few musicians who did reserve duty in this war, like Dana Mehdi being the most prominent example, very popular musician who got called up and was badly wounded in the war.
I remember when he came out of the hospital, and I remember his press conference.
It was quite a moment. And I've heard that Barry Sakharov, who's a really kind of famous Israeli rocker, he must be in his 60s. He's kind of one of the pillars of the Israeli rock scene. A friend who knows him told me this week that he would go, if there was a single soldier wounded in a hospital somewhere in Israel, he would show up. Yeah. He would take his guitar and show up just to play for him. It wasn't a concert. It was Barry Sakharov sitting in a hospital room entertaining someone who'd been badly wounded. And that's true of the other people that you mentioned and many other Israeli musicians whose names probably wouldn't be familiar to listeners. But that is what Israeli musicians have been doing in the past 2 years. They did it with incredible... Maybe heroism is the wrong word in a country where people are actually dying, but it's a kind of heroism, and they do it, and they do it week after week, and they show up for the families, and they've sung at funerals and more funerals and more funerals, and they've sung for people who are suffering from horrific wounds, and they just do it through people who they don't know. But it's really, it's a righteous act, in my opinion, done by people who would probably not describe themselves as religious in any way. But Cohen, in a weird way, ends up being part of that tradition. I think not really understanding it.
Unwittingly.
Unwittingly, yeah. He shows up here in 1973 because the Yom Kippur War has just broken out. He's living on a Greek island called Hydra, hears about the war on the radio, and he just decides to go. If we asked him, he'd probably say he was always deeply identified, or that he was a deeply Jewish character, but he definitely was not living, he's from Montreal, and he grew up in a really well-known synagogue in Montreal called Shar Shamayim, the Shar, which is still a big deal in Montreal. And he was born to a very important family at the synagogue, so he was obviously far away from that. And he was living with a woman, and they just had a kid, and they was living on this Greek island, living kind of bohemian lifestyle. And then it was kind of like the bat signal from Israel. It's like, there's a crisis. The Jews are in crisis. There was a surprise attack on two fronts on Yom Kippur, and things weren't going well. And Cohen just showed up, and he didn't really know what he was going to do. He did not intend to play music. He thought he was going to volunteer on kibbutzim and pick grapefruit or something like that. He didn't have a plan. He showed up. He didn't bring a guitar. He came alone. There were no groupies or, roadies or anything like that. There was no press. And he ends up meeting an Israeli musician in Tel Aviv who says...
At a cafe,
right?
At a
cafe in Tel Aviv. Oshik Levy, also a famous Israeli musician. Right. And Oshik said, listen, we're going to entertain the troops. Come. And Leonard Cohen says, no, my songs are too depressing. They're not going to get people riled up for a battle. And Oshik Levy says, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. And they get into Oshik Levy's Ford Falcon, and they set off to entertain the troops. And it turns into one of the great moments in rock and roll history, in my opinion.
But it wasn't just that, but he kept going and going, right? I mean, he just kept going from base to base throughout the period. But not only is the book just a very strong story, I know that it's been turned into a concert in the last couple of years. And the concert is called Hu by Fire, Mi Ba'esh, which is, in fact, the title of the book. I went with my whole family, and I was really speechless at the very end when you said, let's remember this story as we're sitting here in Jerusalem on whatever the date was. And for me, it was a way of just the power of bringing history into our current situation.
Right. I think what you said also connects to the power of a library, or of this particular library at this moment, because what Cohen does is he goes back to old texts to help him understand current events. Right. So he's looking at a crisis in Israel that starts on Yom Kippur, and he writes a song called Hu by Fire, which is based on the liturgy of Yom Kippur. And during the Vietnam War, he writes a song called Story of Isaac, which is about the sacrifice of Isaac, which is a story from the book of Genesis. And there are other examples, and that's a very Jewish move. You're looking at some kind of crisis in the present, and you ask yourself, what does this remind me of? Where do I have words for this? And it took us a while to figure it out, but when we do this concert, we're doing the same thing with Cohen's words and music. So we're facing a crisis at the present moment in Israel, and we're going back to an artist who came here 50 years ago and
who showed up,
who showed up, and then ended up writing some of the great, to call them pop songs or rock songs or poems in the history of popular music. So it ends up being a very Jewish kind of event, I think, where we're looking back at a singer who showed up, and he was looking back at the Bible and this kind of mix of texts that bounce around from different generations and help us get through whatever crisis we're in at a given moment. There's real power in that, in part because it reminds you that we're living through a very long story, so you can get caught up in the details of the moment. But when you zoom out, whether it's by thinking about the Yom Kippur War in the middle of the Gaza War, or whether it's by thinking about the Bible, or what the Jews went through in medieval times, or when the temple was destroyed, then there's a strange kind of comfort there. It's weird to find comfort in a history that seems sometimes like tragedy after
riddled
tragedy.
With war.
But there is something there that is comforting. And I think that's also very Leonard Cohen, which is that you uplift people not by distracting them or by evading reality. You actually uplift people by diving right into the darkness. And
that's what you did in these concerts.
It's been quite amazing.
Beit Avichai has been hosting these.
Beit Avichai, which is a great cultural institution in Jerusalem, they're the brain behind the show. And we put it on 3 years ago, a year before the war, and it was supposed to be a couple performances. We thought it would be a few shows, and that's what I thought it would be, and yet it keeps selling out, so they keep doing more and more. And it really found its footing, I think, when the war started, a year after we started doing the shows. And suddenly we were talking about this other war, which sounded a lot like the new war. But the event that was of interest to Israelis was the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which was October 6th, 2023. And it's a story of national collapse. It's a story of a terrible surprise during the high holidays. There are many, many echoes here. And the show ended up being ostensibly about that war, but really about this war. And it gained immense power. And because it wasn't an attempt to distract people or to kind of dance around what was going on or just kind of divert people from their sorrows during the Gaza war, it was actually a way of dealing with the Gaza war. I think that was one of the things that made it so popular. So every show we add sells out, and they just keep adding them.
So, I mean, you talk about the need for change, and I think there's something even more profound going on in that there's something about let's call it the DNA of Israeli society, and there's this connective tissue there. And that's what you saw in full glory in all these war rooms, in the hundreds and thousands of people that would show up at funerals of slain soldiers that they didn't even know. There's this whole idea of just total strangers stepping in.
I think it's often underestimated by certainly by our enemies, who see only the political divisiveness and the dysfunction of the political system. And they keep missing the kind of fundamental unity of Jewish society in Israel. And this has happened again and again over the past century, where they think if we can just, hit them hard enough, the whole thing's going to fall apart because they don't agree about anything. And these are people who, came from many different places and spoke different languages and have a very different concept of Judaism and of what their country is. And they keep trying, and it keeps failing. And it just failed again in the past 2 years. And it's because of what you're talking about, because of this tissue that makes the fabric of Israeli society much stronger than people think, even sometimes Israelis, I think. It's the fact that we fundamentally agree that we need a state and that we have nowhere else to go.
Right. I'd like to shift our attention to the North. I found your book, which I actually reread recently, Pumpkin Flowers. It's just a remarkable piece of writing. And your ability to stitch together a very simple, insightful diary, if you will, of one soldier and then other soldiers who are all happen to be serving at a particular outpost in southern Lebanon, and then for you to just interweave it with sort of a broader analysis of Lebanon and the region is really quite strong. Maybe you could just share with us the message of your book.
Thank you. I'm glad that you liked it. Pumpkin Flowers came out, I think, 10 years ago, and it's about my own military service at a very strange outpost in South Lebanon, which was called the Pumpkin. That's the reason for the name of the book. And it's an attempt to look at a very strange war that at the time wasn't really considered a war, and to look at my generation of Israelis who, it's a generation that's quite hard to pin down. I was born in 1977, and it feels like a generation that was just not raised for political leadership or leadership of any kind. So it's an attempt to look at that, at those kids and what we thought we were doing in Lebanon in the 1990s, and also look at this amazing turn of events which we're still living with, which is this idea in the 90s that this conflict is about to be wrapped up, and that indeed we're kind of, at the advent of a great liberal order in which all conflict was going to recede. I mean, that's really what it felt like in the 90s. The Soviet Union collapsed and was replaced by democracies, or so we understood. And Bill Clinton was the president. There was a peace process here. And it really seemed that liberal democracy was the future, and things had been figured out. And I certainly thought that the war in Lebanon was the last war. Certainly the last war of the 20th century, but it ended up being the first war of the 21st century, in that it's a war against a radical Islamic group called Hezbollah, which is not a state. And they're using roadside bombs, IEDs, which becomes one of the, now everyone knows what an IED is. No one did at the time. Suicide bombing is introduced by Hezbollah in the Middle East. So we're really seeing the laboratory where a new kind of warfare is produced. So we think we're at the end of something, but actually we're at the beginning of something. It's a pretty classic human misunderstanding. That's what the book's about.
So I'm just going to read you a line from the book that I thought was very thought-provoking for today. This book is about the lives of young people who finished high school and then found themselves in a war, in a forgotten little corner of a forgotten little war, but one that has nonetheless reverberated in our lives and in the life of our country and the world since it ended one night in the first spring of the new century. Anyone looking for the origins of the Middle East of today, 10 years ago, would do well to look closely at these events. So you wrote at a certain moment where it looked like this chapter was behind us. The Hezbollah chapter was closed. And here we are. Not only did the IDF really take out from Nasrallah on down the most forbidden leaders of Hezbollah, but we basically have a ceasefire with Lebanon.
I think the sentence holds true today. I mean, the conflict that we saw brewing in Lebanon in the 90s, which was really, in the 90s we talked about the New Middle East, which is a term that you probably remember. Shimon Peres made it famous. We thought that the New Middle East was being born around negotiating tables, the Oslo peace process. And the New Middle East was being born in the 90s, but it wasn't being born on the White House lawn. It was being born in South Lebanon. The Middle East that we have now
today
was born
right
there, and it's the Middle East that we saw in the American war in Iraq, and it's the Middle East that we've seen rip apart much of the Middle East over the past 10 years, places like Syria and Libya and Yemen. And it's the Middle East that we've lived with over the past 2 years.
And kids who graduate high school and still go and serve at that outpost. I mean, you're saying that's still part of the reality?
Right. I mean, what I didn't expect is the return to Lebanese territory. So when I remember seeing the army invade Lebanon, which happened during this war, and Israeli ground troops were going back into Lebanon. And my unit was part of the withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000, and my comrades blew up Outpost Pumpkin. I just got out of the army, so I wasn't there, but you really see people going back in, and there are Israeli bases inside Lebanon right now. And it occurred to me, which is something that I wrote in the book, but I think I didn't quite understand what I was writing. And I wrote, I think at some point in the book, that the Lebanon invasion happens in 82 and lasts 18 years. So kids born around the time of the invasion served in Lebanon by the end of it. And my own kids who are now going into the army, I think are quite likely to have some part of their service be in Lebanon, which was, of course, true of me as well. So it's this kind of endless thing, which is not at all what we were expecting in the 1990s, and certainly not at the time that we withdrew from Lebanon in 2000 with dreams of a peaceful border.
So basically, you're hitting on a point that I thought was made rather eloquently by Anthony Julius, who's a lawyer and a prolific author from London, and he talked about the changing dynamic in the relationship between Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora. You have the Jews in the diaspora having to confront a vulnerability of the state of Israel, and then Israelis having to confront our brothers and sisters in Jewish communities around the world with this ongoing anti-Semitism as part of the fabric of their daily lives. So what do you think about that sort of realignment in the Israel-diaspora relationship?
Many of us thought that these were problems that had been solved. So if you grew up in a place like Toronto in the 1990s or 80s, which I did, then you thought that liberal democracy had basically solved the problems that had always faced Jews up until the Second World War, and that Zionism had done that for the Jews in Israel. So when I moved from Toronto to Israel in 1995, I really thought, of course, I couldn't have explained this at the time, but I was 17 years old, but I was moving from one solution to another solution. It didn't strike me as didn't strike me that the fate of the Jews was really unresolved. And I think that what we've seen in the past couple of years, I think some people saw it before October 7th and many people saw it after October 7th, is that this problem has not at all been solved, and that Jews remain a very small number of people beset by hostility that's much deeper and much more deranged than many of us wanted to think, especially because the conflict is described as kind of an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where Israel is some kind of superpower. That we're talking about a very, very small number of people who really do not have the ability to influence events on a large scale. I mean, just for a point of comparison, the number of Muslims in the world is 2 billion. Mm-hmm. So I think that Jews are being confronted with our weakness. I mean, that happened on October 7th, when we were forced to confront images in the sovereign state of Israel that looked like pogroms from, Poland and the 40s, or, from Kishinev in 1903, or from the Rhineland in the 11th century, or, images that were not supposed to recur in the sovereign state of Israel, because in 1948 we stopped being Jews and we became Israelis, and that was supposed to be a break in our history, and things that happened before could not happen afterwards, and they did. Women and children were seized from their homes and marched off into captivity, and we had to confront our weakness. And at the same time, communities in the diaspora, where people may have thought that they, that the arc of history was clear, and that the road to acceptance and potential assimilation was clear, had to confront the sight of hundreds of thousands of people marching through the capitals of the West, screaming for Israeli blood. And I think that it's been a wake-up call. And I think that the lesson of October 7th is, more than anything else, it's that we have to have our eyes open.
It's pretty sobering.
It is, although if we're looking for comfort, I don't think it would have shocked our grandparents to any, or to the same extent. And I think about my grandfather, who was a pretty classic Jewish story, kind of an impoverished kid from Galicia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he fled the Russian advance at Lemberg in 1914 and, kicked around Europe and ended up in an orphanage, and then ended up as a garment worker on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So he lived in a much grimmer world than I grew up in. So this isn't unprecedented. And that's another reason to always go back to the texts. I mean, if you're living in Jewish history, then this makes sense. I mean, it's still awful,
right,
but it makes sense. If you're living, or if you've convinced yourself that Jewish history is over and now you are living outside of it, then yes, I think the past 2 years have come as a real shock.
So what do you think are the most powerful tools in the road to healing to remember what happened here?
I think that, for the Israeli body politic, the key thing that needs to happen is the inquiry into the events of October 7th. I think that Israeli society has incredible capacities to heal. And we've seen it because the country's been through so much, and a country that could be founded after the Holocaust. I mean, we've done feats, that are as impressive as the one we're being asked to do now. If people can get up after that, then we can get up after this. We definitely have the resources, and we have the people, and we have the stories, and there's a real energy in Israeli society that needs to be kind of released in the right direction. And the reason I'm optimistic that it will happen is because we have that when most countries, I think, no longer have it. People are cohesive. People have a sense that they're part of a family, and all of that has been lost in much of the West. So we have a lot to work with.
So one last thing I want to ask you about before we wrap. You have another book coming out of the sky, and I think it's supposed to be released in March of 26. It again plays with this notion of tapping into things that happened in the past, in this case Nazi Europe, to inform our present. So can you give us a sneak preview?
I spent a lot of time in different archives in Israel, mainly the Haganah archive, where the course of this operation is documented. But the National Library, because it has every single Hebrew book ever published or Jewish book ever published, I mean, it's really just an astonishing institution where you can sit down, click on a book that you want, and it could be some obscure book from 1944 or something. Right. Within about half an hour, you have the book. The stacks are a wonder, and the whole new National Library is really the best thing that's happened here in years, and it's really a ray of light. And the fact that it opened during the war is really symbolic, which other people might have decided not to do it, but it was the right decision because it's really what we need. And of course, the library holds the archive of one of the most important characters in the book, who is Hannah Senesh, one of the national heroines of Israel. So the book is about a group of young Jews who escape the Holocaust and make it to British Mandate Palestine in the 40s, and then volunteer to parachute back into the Holocaust in 1944. And the most famous character is Hannah Senesh, but there are some other amazing characters that set off on this mission, which seems insane when you look at it. And it's an attempt to ask what they thought they were doing. I mean, is this Is this one of the bravest missions of the Second World War? Is this an act of insanity? Is it a suicide? Is it a kind of a spectacular suicide? Mm-hmm. And it's also an attempt to look at the stories that they were trying to write, because all of these people were very literary people and they saw what they were doing in a very literary way. And it was about writing as much as it was about anything military, and as much as they were secret agents or spies, they were essentially storytellers. And they were trying to write a different story about the Second World War. And did they succeed? Did they fail? That's what the book's about. It's an attempt to kind of rescue them both from obscurity, which I think unfortunately has befallen many of them, but also to rescue them from becoming two-dimensional Zionist kind of cartoons, which Hannah Senesh did become. She became kind of like a Davy Crockett style, just kind of an image of a woman in uniform or something, but she's so much more complicated than that and so much more interesting. So I'm trying to restore their humanity and also look at what Israel thought it was doing. Like, what is Zionism? So you have to kind of strip away a lot of history and a lot of complexity and go back to the core. And I think the core is Senesh and her comrades.
Amazing. I know in the archives there's the original letter that she wrote to her mother, Hannah Senesh, right before she was executed, which the laundress in the prison found in her dress, in the pocket of her dress. And they returned it to her mother, who later immigrated to Palestine. So before we wrap up, I've got to ask you, this is a page that I'm taking out of the Call Me Back book. Mati, what gives you hope?
It's really the daily life of Israel. If you live in the country, and I just rode my bike here from my street, which is not far away, and the life of the country continues, and it's incredibly resilient, and it's been resilient throughout this entire terrible period. And these kids are going to school, and they're speaking Hebrew to each other, and they think that's totally normal. They don't think that there's anything unique about that.
Yeah.
So it's hard to live here and not feel that this country offers many possibilities.
A different version of what you're saying is that you really feel, being here, that you are part of something much larger than just yourself. I'm sure when you hear your kids speak Hebrew, it just reminds you of this arc of history. I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us. This podcast is Talk in the Library, which I think is just a great way to have conversations with leading intellectuals and authors and different leaders in Israel about how conversations of today can meet some of our ancient stories.
Thank you again for having me.